starting, I think.
Great.
Start.
All right. Our case here is pretty simple. We think that the economic, military, and human rights policies that have been engaged in by the Crown Prince are generally good for the ability for the Saudi government to actually maintain its current amount of power, as well as just broadly good for the for Saudi Arabia as a whole. We think on that particular basis, this is something that we're very happy to support. What are we talking about in terms of the policies that that bin Salman actually proposes? We're talking about things like divestment from strict focus on oil within the economy. We're talking about crackdown on human rights activists, as well as support for women's rights. And lastly, we're talking about things like the increase in military spending and advocacy for things like intervention in Yemen. We think on all of those grounds, where the Saudi government is actually able to increase the amount of public support that it advocates, that it allows for, in terms of decreasing the amount of internal dynamics that actually exist, and thirdly, in terms of just broadly allowing for better international relations. Sure.
Does this include cracking down on corruption within the Saudi government?
Yeah. We're talking about just literally all of his policies, so that's just everything's on the table. I think the way that we're going to formulate this case is in terms of talking about these specific groups of policies that broadly the Crown Prince is actually advocating for, i.e. first in terms of economics, second in terms of human rights, thirdly in terms of military, and we're going to talk about why in each specific case that's something that's actually going to be beneficial for the ruling house of Assad, of Saud as a whole. Okay, firstly let's talk about economic policies. We think broadly what the Crown Prince is actually advocating for here is good for the long-term economic future of Saudi Arabia. So for example, what he's actually talking about is the moving away from oil, right? So the investment of, let's say, other forms of manufacturing or high-tech industries. That's necessarily good in terms of just ensuring that Saudi Arabia has a long-term economic future that's not dependent on a strictly volatile resource. We think on that particular basis, you have the decreased ability for things like recessions that exist within Saudi Arabia. We think that's good in terms of maintaining public support of the country. The second thing that that the Crown Prince actually advocates for is some amount of decrease in terms of state control of industry. So for example, allowing for the selling of shares of some national oil companies. We think this is a sort of trade-off that's actually necessary in terms of, let's say, increasing things like competition that exists within the Saudi Arabian market. And even though that means that the ruling house of Saud has marginally less power in terms of not having as much control of state industry, we think still that's necessarily good in terms of engaging the long-term economic future of Saudi Arabia. On that basis, we think that's something that's good. Secondly, let's talk about human rights policies. This basically has three things. The first is increased support for women's rights. We think this is good insofar as that, for example, in terms of allowing women to drive cars. We think this is good because a lot of these policies actually have massive amounts of public support. What that means is that basically by catering to the general public, the ruling house of Saud is able to actually ensure that it has consolidated rule over its government and over its people. We think that's good in terms of just nations. Secondly, we think that what it allows for is just positive reputation on the international scale, insofar as Saudi Arabia has received a lot of backlash and a lot of controversy in terms of its human rights policies. We think the move generally in a more liberal direction when it comes to things like women's rights means that it's better able to consolidate international relations as a whole, particularly towards Western states, insofar as a lot of their military arms by countries like Canada or the United States, a lot of those relations are determinant on public support for Saudi Arabia within those other states. Secondly, in terms of the detention of human rights activists, we think this is good in terms of quashing the opposition that actually exists to the Saudi government within Saudi Arabia. So for example, we say that a lot of the human rights activists that he's actually cracking down on are those that actually support relatively minority issues in terms of minority religious groups or minority social causes. What that means is that they don't actually have massive amounts of public backing behind them at that moment. So crucially here, even though you have a small minorities that otherwise probably would not, let's say, support or vote the Saudi government anyways, we say when you get rid of their leaders and actually their ability to actually advocate for themselves, then you decrease their ability to actually run significant opposition campaigns to the current House of Saud's government. We think that's good. The third thing that is actually happening here under his human rights policies, the crackdown on members of specifically of the ruling family, i.e. the House of Saud itself. Why is this good? First of all, we think that it reduces infighting in terms of actually creates a consistent stance by which the House of Saud can actually advocate under. We think that's good in terms of the long-term future of the House of Saud, insofar as a lot of it, we think its most important threats are actually internal within itself, in terms of, let's say, different members who have, let's say, control over different state companies or different branches of government actually trying to fight in terms of the amount of power that they can actually achieve. But insofar, we say in terms of the long-term future of the House of Saud, it's best if you have a much more consolidated voice and a much more consolidated base of action by getting rid of a lot of these people that are actually opposers to the current Saudi government within the House of Saud. We think that that's good in terms of trying to get rid of that. Third thing that we want to talk about in terms of military spending, but sure.
It seems less clear that these officials are opposed to the Saudi government and more opposed solely to Mohammed bin Salman. Like, why is that exactly?
Yeah, so we think that bin Salman's policies just more broadly are much more beneficial to the Saudi people, i.e. economically, than a lot of the other individuals who will allow for strictly increased state control of, let's say, oil industries. But secondly, what we think is actually good is insofar he's the individual that likely has the most amount of power in the status quo, it's much more efficient for him to be actually getting rid of a lot of these external forces than it is for any other member of this House of Saud to attempt to do so. Thirdly, about military spending. One, we think it just allows for the consolidation of the ruling family's power, insofar as it has a larger military force to back them. So in terms of the quash of internal opposition groups, as well as rebel forces, terrorism, etc. We think that's crucial, and we think the key link here is that there are particularly good relations between the military as well as the ruling family as a whole, which means that you don't necessarily get much significant amounts of opposition from military generals or things like that, which means that they're largely under the Saudi government's control. So we think that they're largely able to actually ensure that the military acts in their best interest and is able to actually deal with the opposition forces that exist on the ground. The second thing that we want to talk about specifically here is intervention within Yemen. We think this increase in public support, insofar as that generally just happens during times of war, we think that's something that's actually good in the short term, while the Saudi government consolidates its basically its reconstruction. The second thing, though, is in terms of the consolidation of an empire against external rebel groups and external threats. We say that its ability to, let's say, crack down on rebel forces within Yemen ensures that it's able to basically engage it, consolidate its own empire within the Middle East. We think that's good in terms of the long-term economic benefits that actually provides to Saudi Arabia. We think that the people are actually going to benefit from that. We think that's going to be particularly good in terms of the amount of public support that the Saudi government is able to achieve. But more generally, we think in terms of just the consolidation of power under the hands of this ruling House of Saud, specifically, we think on both of these grounds, this is just broadly beneficial for their long-term ability to actually stay in power. Very proud to propose.
Get up close and personal, Dennis.
Oh god, this is too close. I'm gonna stand. It feels awkward sitting. Okay, everyone ready? We think that above all else, the Saudi Arabian government, and more specifically the House of Saud, needs to consider stability of their nation and stability of the government above all else. Because if they risk losing stability, if they risk causing vast civil unrest, then none of the impacts which government brings you actually apply and are outweighed as a result, because you will not garner any of them when you lack the ability to maintain control within your government and within your nation. Firstly, some significant mitigatory rebuttal, as well as some turns on what we've heard from opening government, and then 2 points on why we believe instability will be caused as a result of Mohammed's policies, namely why purging and the cracking down on corruption, or at least leaders he claims to be corrupt, will lead to this, and secondly, why westernization is a destabilizing force within Saudi Arabia. Okay, firstly, on rebuttal, responding to the idea of economic policies. So, a few things here. Firstly, I think it's important to note that the losing of state control over over oil industries is not just a marginal loss of power. We think it is a significant loss of power, and they thus have a higher burden than what they've brought you to prove to you that the sort of resulting economic increase will actually outweigh. Because given that this resolution is from the perspective of the House of Saud, we think that ultimately power is what you want, because you want to be able to maintain rule over your country. And we do not think that giving up your power of the most powerful industry and most meaningful resource you have in your nation is simply a marginal loss in power. We think it's a significant one. See, a more accurate characterization is westernization and making these companies go public. So, for example, Saudi Aramco is opening on the London Stock Exchange, which means it's ultimately losing power to a new board of directors. We think this is not just a marginal loss of power for the House of Saud, it is significant and is something they need to do a better job outweighing in terms of economic policies, especially when I don't think they've done a very good job of explaining as to why this is an improved state on the oil industry than how it currently is, outside of like a minor thing about increased competition. Okay. Secondly, responding to the idea of internal threats, sort of like these purgings that he's doing, and additionally the military/intervention. Okay, so firstly, I think the biggest problem with this is that this is sort of analogous to the Ottoman Empire, in which you have excessively consolidated power. Notice that Luke literally uses the phrase consolidated power. And this is important because what this means is it might work for a few leaders, but ultimately all you need is one real dumbass down the line to sort of collapse your entire empire. We don't think that's a risk you should take, because in the current status quo, instead you have a house of elites by which power is relatively equally distributed. Like, obviously there is a hierarchy within this house, but prior to Mohammed bin Salman, it was not as consolidated, and as they've stated themselves, his policies have tried to increase consolidation within the leader of the house and within those who only agree with him. Secondly, responding to the idea of intervention, I just think there's a lack of clear impacts here. Like, maybe the deputy can give a better idea of why this is a good thing, because I don't know exactly why causing increased instability within the Middle East and also detracting the support from Western allies is a good thing. It simply said, hey, it's good that we're intervening. I don't think that's something we buy off the bat. Okay, our two arguments. Firstly, why we think purging inherent and sort of the imprisoning of members within the House inherently leads to instability. 3 subpoints here. Firstly, notice that there's also a seizing of capital with this purging, i.e. what the leaders attempted to do is put other elites in jail and then seize their assets and contribute it to the crown. This is important because members who have currently not been seized or been attacked by these policies are very likely to leave. You thus have sort of a vast capital flight from the richest and most powerful members of the House of Saud and members of Saudi Arabian of the country in general. This leads to capital flight, decreased investment, but also instability within the business sector, and I think this is significant because it turns a lot of the economic impacts they give you. If you lack the ability to even have substantial investment or businesses, the establishment of companies within your nation, you're not going to have all these improved economic impacts they talk about. Second subpoint here is that we tell you there will also be tensions within the ruling class who stay. And this is important because long term, if this doesn't ultimately foment and explode into just a literal civil war, it is very likely that the tensions will stop them from solving problems when solidarity is necessary. We tell you the House of Saud, at the very least, it is in their interest to generally be united, or if not completely united on policies, to be united in a way by which they can get over their differences, i.e. like reach compromises, etc. We tell you when there are these vast degrees of tensions, it is unlikely that you will do so. Instead, you will simply not be able to reach agreements, and that just increases the probability for what we told you before, which is like actual civil war and significant conflicts, which decrease your power and hurt your interest in the long run. I'll get you in a second. Third subpoint is that we think this is compounded by the fact that purging can now be viewed as a legitimate tactic by rulers within the House of Saud. This is important because of 2 things. One, it means Mohammed bin Salman could simply do this more and cause more unrest within the government. But secondly, if a new leader comes in, they can easily justify these types of purges. This is very important because this increases all of the previous points we talked about why this leads to fear within the elite, why it leads to capital flight and flight of the elite, because they now know that if another leader comes in, that leader can easily react to what has happened prior to him and justify increased purging. It is easier to justify these things when previous leaders have done them, as is being done now. Yeah.
So escalation of tensions between members of the ruling House of Saud has basically happened for the past decades. What is the mechanism by which you actually ensure that there is some amount of cooperation between those ruling members?
I think not purging, right? Like I think that purging them has ultimately caused increased tensions, right? Like you can say there were tensions beforehand, right? But that doesn't remove your ability to increase said tensions. Okay. Secondly, why we think westernization is a destabilizing force within Saudi Arabia. Okay, 2 points here. Firstly, note that this is by and large a Muslim nation. It is a vast majority Muslim. Luke himself admits that, like other non-Muslim groups, are significant minorities or are significantly small minorities within the country, etc. So what this ultimately means is that taking this action will by and large be viewed as going against this majority, but also going against sort of the more intangible national identity that Saudi Arabia has. We think this is very likely to lead to civil unrest and potential negative responses to these changes. But additionally, I think it's important to note that this isn't like an effective progressive iteration towards westernization. It is radical change. This increases the chances and the propensity for the people within the country to respond negatively and to respond in unrest. But why does this go particularly against the interests of the House of Saud? It is important to note that they have very much built their rule around Muslim identity, around ruling in a non-particularly secular way. What this means is that it weakens their image within Saudi Arabia. Thus, no matter how the public responds, House of Saud, but in particular the most likely scenario in which we think people don't support this, and we've told you why not, it opens way for other leaders to simply take over, or other houses to undo your rule, because they now have significant public support. An example of this is Turkey, in which Erdogan has continued to be able to improve his power over opposition because he has appealed to these powerful far-right sympathizers within his country. For all these reasons, and just stop instability, we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Camera's still running. It doesn't matter.
As opening government, we're going to give you a proper characterization of how we actually achieve long-term power and stability for the House of Saud. And we're going to do this within 3 scopes. Firstly, domestic public perception, international public perception, and then also the internal conflicts that happen. Why we tell you that Salman's policies in the long term and in the short term are in the best interest for stability on all of these 3 ideas. So why do we give you the best case for the interests of the House of Saud? We give you the best metric by which you can understand why we consolidate long-term power. And I'm going to be breaking this down for you into 2 main subpoints. Firstly, about public perception, 2 scopes under this, domestic and international. Firstly, under domestic, we're going to tell you that, what Luke gave you in his speech, that the diversification of the economy creates for better long-term economic growth. We think that things like moving away from oil means things like more opportunity for high-skilled labor, and also just less recessions. We think this is better for public perception, and there's generally just more support for the policies of the House of Saud. What does opening opposition give you in refutation to this idea? They tell you that essentially it's a loss of power, which means that there will effectively be less control for the House of Saud. First of all, we don't think that this is a fair characterization of what would actually happen, or what is actually happening when we diversify the economy. We tell you that there is some exchange of power. Sure, the House of Saud does on net lose some power, but we think that in the long term, for better economic policies, the diversification of the economy is definitely a better thing to pursue in the interest of the long term. Secondly, on this idea of selling shares, we don't think that this necessarily outweighs the benefits of having better public perception when you see that there is less concentration of power, and we think that in the long term this weighs out any of the benefits, the negatives that they give you in opening opposition. Secondly, Luke gives you this idea about human rights, and we think that this is incredibly important when we look at what the long term goals are for the House of Saud. When we tell you that when there's better public support for things like women's rights and just human rights in general, we think that this is in the interest of the House of Saud, because that means that they're better able to consolidate power within their domestic situation. This idea wasn't really addressed at all on opposition. We need a response to this in the second speaker. Secondly, we tell you that when Luke gives you the idea that Salman pursuing policies of detaining human rights activists from minority groups is better for the long-term stability, we tell you these kinds of policies are incredibly important for the House of Saud, because it quashes a lot of the opposition that is actually incredibly harmful to the public perception of like a lot of policies that are being pursued by the Saudi Arabian government. Thirdly, he gives you the idea of military spending. We think that this is actually incredibly important because a better relation between the military and like the ruling family means that they're effectively better able to consolidate power in terms of like control both domestically and on the international scale, which leads me into my second scope, which is how public international perception is actually incredibly important for long-term consolidation of power. Firstly, we tell you about things like human rights, like intervention and crackdown on corruption is incredibly important if we want greater like Western and international collaboration, because this means that like if the Saudi Arabian government has this international perception of doing a lot of really terrible things like committing atrocities towards human rights and just like generally not giving women's rights, then there would be a lot less like public will in the West, for example, to like pursue collaboration with Saudi Arabia. So on the net, we think that like greater investment in things like trade and military cooperation between the West and Saudi Arabia is a lot better for House of Saud. Therefore, we think that like having things like human rights crackdowns, even if it does create internal conflict within the House of Saud, is overall better for the longevity of the House of Saud. I'm actually going to be getting into like the internal conflicts later, why that actually doesn't get worse on our side of the house. Opposition gives you this idea about like how the Western influence weakens the identity of the House of Saud. We don't think that they give you a fair characterization of why this is necessarily the case, especially when already there's a lot of like U.S. funding into the military for Saudi Arabia, and there isn't a lot of like backlash coming from the people of Saudi Arabia. We think that on net, if like what the West gives to Saudi Arabia can help them consolidate more like military power, then that is generally a positive thing. Sure.
But on this, as well as your previous point, I think the problem is that the general public always responds significantly more to social policies than economic policies, especially when you think of things like international trade, where they tend not to feel the effects until like very long down the line. This is why we tell you there's more significant backlash now and why they will respond to this negatively.
Okay, well, we think that like what the collaboration necessarily means isn't just in terms of economic policies. A lot of the important support that comes from the US, for example, is like military support. And Luke gave you an entire like constructive point about why having more military spending is generally better for the stability of the House of Saud, why that consolidates more power for the family, and how this doesn't actually like create any kind of public backlash insofar as Saudi Arabia is seen as being like more powerful with like Western like trade and influence. Also, we don't think that like the rhetoric that surrounds Western collaboration is that Saudi Arabia is like necessarily under the thumb of the United States. Like we don't think that's the narrative that comes out of the collaboration on an international scale. And even if this were the case, we think that this is more of a short-term harm. And when you outweigh the long-term benefits of having more collaboration, more stability, we think that like we would much rather have international cooperation as a result of better human rights policies. Okay, second idea is on the internal like conflicts that happen within the House of Saud when someone like pursues a lot of his policies, right? So firstly, we tell you in Luke's constructive speech, he tells you about the consistency of the moral stance within the House of Saud. We think that this is not only important for the long term, but also for the short term, in which he can actually justify a lot of the purges that he is like trying to pursue, and that he's like essentially cracking down on only the corrupt politicians within like the Saudi Arabian government. We think that this like, though it does create like more internal conflict, is better in the long term because there is a more consistent moral stance. People like not only within the domestic realm but like internationally know what the House of Saud now stands for. Secondly, we tell you that there's going to be less infighting anyways, because like what opposition completely misses is that in the status quo there still is a lot of like infighting within the House of Saud anyways, when people want to have like more control of power within the House of Saud, regardless of whether or not there's a crackdown on corruption. We think that things like this happen a lot less when there generally is just the narrative that we don't support corruption at all. What do they give you under this idea? They tell you that purges are bad for long-term stability. Firstly, we tell you that purges have always happened, like they've always been a thing that happens in a lot of these countries, and they have like no really warrants to why this would get a lot worse now that like Salman is doing this. And, like conversely, we tell you that it is a lot better when there's like a proper moral stance that is pursued when Salman is like pursuing purges under the narrative of cracking down on corruption. On all of these fronts, we're very proud to propose.
Hollywood bit over here.
Insert.
This is still recording. Okay. We'll talk about two things broadly in this speech. The first thing I'm going to talk about is power dynamics within Saudi Arabia, how Mohammed bin Salman's policies directly affect the power dynamics and remove power away from the ruling class of Saud, which is presumably against their interests. About stability, why his policies pursued in concert as he is doing currently lead to increased instability, and why that instability is going to be so problematic for Saudi Arabia in the long term. First, on power dynamics within Saudi Arabia. Dennis gave you a couple of points as to why this shifts power dynamics. The first is that this consolidates power in Mohammed bin Salman himself, which is bad for two reasons. One, because it comes at the expense of the power of the rest of the ruling class. So it's important to note that the ruling class of Saud is not just Mohammed bin Salman. There is a vast network of princes and other ruling class members who are now being put under house arrest and having their assets seized. Presumably, the aggregate interest of the ruling class of Saud is not to have half their members locked up in some hotel and their assets seized. So we think this, on its face, is an attack on their interests. Secondly, though, Dennis gives you the example of the Ottoman Empire, that even if it is the case that in the short run that Mohammed bin Salman is a good leader, the consolidation of power in him specifically is bad in the long term, because it only takes one bad leader to actually cause the collapse of the state in and of itself. See the Ottoman Empire. The problem is that in the status quo, power is not consolidated in one actor, so it is spread amongst a vast majority of actors, whether that's economic power or political power. When you purge them and consolidate in one actor, you lead to all of these problems, as the Ottoman Empire saw. The second class of power dynamics that get affected is this westernization that he is pushing. So I think it's important to note that the economic development that Mohammed bin Salman is pushing is not necessarily diversification away from oil, which sounds on its face good, and we are fine with that in the broadest sense. But the way that he is pursuing this is the pursuit of Western ideals of business, opening up to Western actors, listing Saudi companies on public Western exchanges, and opening up several Western industries such as cinemas and other things. We think all of these come at the expense of Saudi culture and Saudi business for two reasons. One, we tell you that this goes against, in the vast majority of cases, the religious and traditionalist objections of the vast majority of the Saudi populace. That is to say that the vast majority of the Saudi populace is fairly misogynist, right? And in doing so is the vast majority of the ruling class of Saud, right? They're perfectly fine with disallowing cinemas and other things that fall in line with their religious conceptions. We think this goes against those interests when you force westernization on these people. Secondly, though, is the pivot to Western powers comes necessarily at the expense of Saudi and Islamic power. Two ways. One is in the impact of culture and tradition. When you open things up to Western cinema and Western culture, this comes obviously at the expense of Saudi culture and Saudi tradition, because some people will choose to go for the Western cultures and traditions as opposed to the Saudi culture. This is obviously against the ruling class of Saud's interests, since they are majority in control of Saudi culture. Secondly, though, is the entrance of Western actors comes at Saudi business. That is to say that when you allow a Western business like BP to now mine Saudi oil, that comes at the expense of Aramco's ability to mine that same oil. You disagree, Luke?
Yeah. So in terms of the general views of the entire populace, how can you assert that those are particularly conservative while at the same time you have massive amounts of public support for, let's say, allowing women to drive?
Okay, so the problem is that I don't think that Mohammed bin Salman intends to stop with allowing women to drive, right? There are a vast majority of his policies that are opposed by religious imams within the country, and it's going to lead to a lot of political instability because a lot of it goes against the religious tendencies and the grain of Saudi Arabia. Okay, secondly, I want to start with an observation on stability, right? It is insufficient for government to get up here and say that each of Mohammed bin Salman's policies are good in a vacuum. So even if you buy that the policies that they have listed are good in and of themselves, we think that they have to be good in concert, that in together, when they're being pursued simultaneously, that lead to all of the benefits that they need to prove. So we think this puts a burden on them to prove that the vast majority, that all of these policies pursued in concert are going to be good. Why is this problematic for them? Dennis told you individually how each one of these policies causes backlash both religiously, socially, and economically, and politically for that matter. But we tell you that this backlash and instability compounds upon itself multiplicatively, because these individuals who are angry at one aspect, like a social aspect of his policy, are now angered by the political and economic aspects of his policy as well. And as a result, they just get mad and reach that critical mass of backlash where they actually start fomenting revolution and things that are quite bad for the state. So why is stability thus so important for Saudi Arabia? We tell you that it's facilitated with 3 goals of the ruling class of Saud. First, on geopolitical goals. Second, on the retention of power and political stability. And thirdly, on economic stability and growth. How does this outweigh the 3 areas of benefit that OG gives us? Because all 3 of the benefits that OG gives us are path dependent on stability. I'll go through a little bit of explanation here. First, on economic development. Economic development requires a long-term perception of the stability of growth. So critically, even if we prove to you that only a perception of instability exists, even if instability doesn't actually occur, this is sufficient to actually stymie any sort of economic growth that they want to give you on their side of the house. Secondly, on human rights, we tell you that you can't have long-term human rights when there's vast majority, or when you have religious backlash, because then you just regress to a position previously where you are now worse for human rights in the long term. Thirdly, on military spending, it can't happen if you don't have the control of your own state. So it's impossible to go and police other states when you don't even have political control of your own. Okay, so what are these 3 goals and how do we facilitate them, or how are they stymied by instability? First, on geopolitical goals. You need stability in order to pursue any sort of geopolitical power in the region. This means that you are unable to kind of actually focus your efforts on outside forces when you're dealing with internal storm. One, on Iran, when the context is that Iran is now opened its economy finally now that they're no longer subject to sanctions and they're making vast geopolitical moves in Yemen and things like that. You're also seen as Saudi Arabia is seen as a Sunni leader, and you lose that position when you have vast instability within your state. Secondly, on political stability and retention of power, Dennis told you 3 things. He told you it sets a precedent of overthrowing the ruling class when you don't like them and you're in power. Second, that religious backlash can be dangerous. And thirdly, the danger of consolidation in the long term. They gave us 2 answers. The first was that this was done for a principled reason. Okay, first of all, no. A lot of these people were simply in opposition to Mohammed bin Salman. But secondly, even if that's true, the perception is that this is done as kind of an antagonistic manner. Secondly, on disagreement, we tell you that they say that purges have always existed. Yes, but this is a significant increase in capital forfeiture and house arrest. We think that's significant. Thirdly, on economic stability and growth. Dennis told you about how Aramco and the publicization of SOEs comes at the expense of Saudi control. What is the example here? We tell you that when the Saudis control Aramco, they can use the funds for military spending or economic stimulus. That never happens when the board of directors in London controls them. Secondly, they tell you about diversification and why this is good. There are other ways to do this other than Mohammed bin Salman's policies. They can do this while still owning state-owned enterprise. We don't think that's sufficient. All these reasons, proud to oppose.